Welcome to Pastcast. You're listening to an audio summary and review of Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis, written by J.D. Vance. This production was created by the Pastcast channel to help you explore the deeply personal and widely relevant story of one man's journey through America's working-class heartland. We hope this audio experience gives you new insight into the struggles, values, and identity of a part of America too often overlooked. Thanks for listening, and we hope it leaves you wiser, more thoughtful, and better equipped to understand the world around you. Scene 1, Introduction. What is a Hillbilly Elegy? This isn't a book about politics. It's not about blame either. It's about a place and a people, and one man's struggle to break free from the weight of both. J.D. Vance begins his memoir by telling us plainly, Hillbilly Elegy is the story of his life, but it's also the story of a culture in crisis, a culture that gave him pride and pain, strength and trauma, a culture that, in his words, is struggling to hold on. He was raised in Middletown, Ohio, a fading steel town where his family settled after leaving the hills of eastern Kentucky. His people were Scots-Irish hillbillies, Appalachian working class, fiercely loyal and suspicious of outsiders. They believed in hard work, family, country, and Jesus. But those beliefs didn't always translate into stable lives. In fact, quite the opposite. The hillbillies J.D. grew up with had a code. They were proud, tough, and deeply emotional. They didn't always trust the government or each other. Violence was common. Addiction was ever present. Jobs were disappearing, and along with them, so was hope. But they held on to something else, a powerful belief in their own resilience, even as the world around them crumbled. J.D. tells us that to outsiders, his life might have looked doomed from the start. A revolving door of father figures, a mother struggling with addiction, poverty that never let up, school systems that didn't expect much, friends who disappeared into prison or overdoses, and yet, he made it. Somehow, he made it. But this isn't a triumphalist story. J.D. isn't interested in patting himself on the back. Instead, he wants to understand what helped him escape, and what holds others back. Why do so many kids with stories like his never leave? Why does the cycle of chaos repeat? Why is it that in some communities, despite opportunities, people still fall behind? In this book, he explores those questions through the lens of his own life. He doesn't claim to speak for all poor white Americans, but his experience, he says, is common enough to offer insight. He also offers a warning that we, as a country, don't fully understand what's happening in places like Middletown. We talk about policy, but ignore pain. We debate programs, but overlook people. And we cling to stereotypes without asking deeper questions. So this is his elegy, not for a person, but for a place and a way of life that's fading. Not just economically, but emotionally, spiritually, culturally. J.D. isn't angry. He's conflicted. He loves his family, but he doesn't excuse their failures. He believes in personal responsibility, but he knows the weight of trauma. He's proud of his roots, but he's also haunted by them. That complexity is what makes this memoir more than just a story. It's a reflection of who he is and of the country he calls home. This is where the story begins. A boy born into a world of contradictions, a world where love and violence coexist, where pride masks pain, and where the American dream seems just out of reach, but not entirely lost. Scene 2. The Vance family history. To understand J.D. Vance, you have to meet the Vances. And to understand the Vances, you have to begin in the hollers of Kentucky. Jackson, Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian hills, is where J.D.'s story begins. Not with him, but with his grandparents, James and Bonnie Vance. Everyone called them Papa and Mama. They were children of coal miners, born into poverty, surrounded by violence, pride, and a sense of fierce independence. In the 1940s and 50s, like millions of other Appalachian families, Papa and Mama left the mountains and migrated north to find work. They settled in Middletown, Ohio, a steel town with factories, unions, and the promise of a better life. It was the heart of the Rust Belt, and for a time, that promise felt real. Papa got a job at Armco Steel, where men could earn a middle-class living without a college degree. He worked hard. Mama kept house and raised their children. They bought a modest home, owned a car, and put food on the table. To JD, it looked like they had made it. But the truth was more complicated. The Vances brought with them more than their belongings. They brought the pain and pride of Appalachia. Papa was an alcoholic. Mama was fiercely loyal, but short-tempered and occasionally violent. Their marriage was turbulent. Explosive arguments, separations, and reconciliations defined their early years. Once, Mama even tried to burn Papa alive by setting him on fire with gasoline. She had a saying, "If you ever hit me again, I'll kill you." And she meant it. Yet despite all this, JD loved them deeply. To him, Mama and Papa were not just flawed. They were heroic. They protected him. They gave him a sense of identity. Mama, in particular, would become the stabilizing force in his life. The Vance family embodied the contradictions of their culture. They believed in hard work, but didn't always follow through. They taught loyalty, but often fought viciously. They prized honor, yet lived in chaos. JD's mother, Bev, grew up in this environment. She was smart and ambitious, but deeply wounded by her parents' volatility. As a teenager, she ran wild. She married young, had JD's older sister, then remarried and had JD. Her relationships were unstable, and over time, so was she. Bev would eventually become addicted to prescription pills, then heroin. She cycled through men. JD counted more than a dozen father figures by the time he reached adulthood. Some were decent, some were violent, none were permanent. Despite her struggles, Bev wasn't a villain. JD describes her as brilliant, funny, and caring when she was sober. But sobriety didn't last. Her addiction took over, and chaos followed. Throughout his childhood, JD bounced between households. Sometimes he lived with his mom, other times with Mama and Papa, occasionally with his older sister or other relatives. There were moments of peace, but they never lasted. Still, through all the instability, one thing endured: the influence of his grandparents. Mama, especially, became JD's guardian angel and his drill sergeant. She swore like a sailor, smoked like a chimney, and carried a pistol in her purse. She was crude, combative, and unfiltered, but she loved JD fiercely. She believed in his potential when almost no one else did. She pushed him to study, to stay out of trouble, and to believe he was capable of more. She had escaped Kentucky once, and she believed JD could escape Middletown too. Mama believed in something she called hillbilly justice. She didn't trust institutions or outsiders. If someone crossed her family, she took matters into her own hands. JD recalls her threatening teachers, confronting bullies, and even chasing a boy with a baseball bat. She wasn't elegant, but she was effective. The story of the Vance family is not just personal, it's cultural. It's about how Appalachian traditions, honor, defiance, self-reliance, clashed with the realities of modern life. It's about how pain passes down through generations, often disguised as strength. JD sees his family's story as both a cautionary tale and a source of pride. He doesn't romanticize them, but he doesn't reject them either. They made mistakes, they caused harm, but they also gave him the grit and loyalty that helped him survive. In the Vance family, love and violence sat at the same table. Promises were made, broken, and made again. And through it all, JD was learning, not just how to survive, but what kind of man he did and did not want to become. Scene 3. Growing up in chaos. If J.D. Vance's childhood could be described in one word, it would be unstable. His mother, Bev, was brilliant, energetic, and full of potential, but she was also impulsive, erratic, and increasingly addicted. J.D.'s home life was a revolving door of boyfriends, marriages, fights, police calls, and broken promises. There was no steady rhythm, no dependable routine. School, meals, bedtime, they all depended on how his mom was feeling that week, or whether she was clean, or whether she had a boyfriend to fight with. One day, she might be loving and attentive. The next, she might be throwing things, screaming, or threatening suicide. JD never knew what he was walking into. He recalls waking up to fights in the middle of the night, being dragged into cars for dramatic getaways, or hiding in corners while adults screamed obscenities. He developed what psychologists call toxic stress. His brain was constantly on edge. And like many kids in similar environments, he learned to adapt, not by trusting, but by anticipating danger. He was always scanning the room, watching people's moods, ready to react. At school, JD struggled, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked stability. He often arrived tired, distracted, or angry. His homework was inconsistent. He didn't know how to ask for help, and when teachers tried, he didn't trust them. After all, if you couldn't trust your own family, why would you trust a stranger? Yet even in the chaos, there were moments of hope. His older sister, Lindsay, tried to protect him. She grew up fast, stepped in as a surrogate mother, and tried to create little pockets of normalcy when their mom spiraled. But she was still a child herself, and the weight was enormous. And then there was Mama. By now, Mama had become JD's primary emotional anchor. She didn't have custody, but she had influence. When JD's mom was arrested, or when things at home got too dangerous, Mama would take him in. Her house was small, cluttered, and smelled like smoke, but it was safe. And most importantly, it was consistent. Meals were served, rules were clear. JD was expected to do homework, show respect, and get his act together. Mama didn't tolerate excuses. She also didn't tolerate pity. She'd say, "You can do it. You're not your mother." She'd slap the back of his head when he swore, and then make him soup when he was sick. One of JD's turning points came in middle school. He had started to spiral, getting bad grades, skipping school, hanging out with the wrong crowd. But Mama stepped in. She let him move in permanently and laid down the law. He didn't like it at first, but slowly, things began to change. His grades improved. He started to care about his future. He discovered that with structure, he could focus. And with encouragement, he could succeed. But healing wasn't linear. JD still carried deep emotional wounds. He had trouble trusting adults. He doubted himself constantly, and he feared becoming like his mother. In the middle of it all, JD faced another crushing blow. Papa, his grandfather and occasional refuge, died. JD was devastated. It was a stark reminder that even the people he depended on most weren't permanent. Still, the foundation Mama provided began to stick. JD wasn't magically healed, but he was no longer drifting. He had rules, expectations, and someone who believed in him, even if she showed it by yelling and cursing. He also began to realize something more painful. The chaos of his childhood wasn't normal. It wasn't just the way things are. Many of his classmates had stable homes. They didn't live in fear. They didn't expect violence, and they weren't constantly bracing for the next crisis. This realization filled JD with shame and resentment. Why had his life been different? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why had the people who were supposed to care about him failed so completely? But this awareness also sparked something else, a desire to break the cycle. JD began to see that if he wanted a different life, he would have to build it himself. No one was coming to rescue him. No government program, no distant father figure, no magical mentor. Just grit. And maybe Mama. This was the paradox of his youth. He loved his family, but he also knew he had to leave them, emotionally, mentally, and eventually, geographically, if he was going to survive. That internal tension between loyalty and self-preservation would define much of his adult life. And it began here, in a small, smoky home with an old woman who cussed like a sailor, watched Matlock religiously, and quietly saved his life. Scene 4. The Culture of Despair. By the time J.D. Vance was old enough to reflect on the world around him, he began to realize that it wasn't just his family in trouble. It was the entire culture surrounding them. His neighborhood in Middletown had changed. Factories were closing. Jobs were disappearing. Neighbors who once woke early for the day shift now slept until noon, or didn't work at all. The front porches that once held laughing families now sat empty, or worse, became places where people drank, argued, or escaped into drugs. It wasn't just economic decline, it was something deeper, a kind of emotional and spiritual withdrawal. JD calls it learned helplessness, a term used in psychology to describe people who have suffered so much failure that they stop believing in the possibility of success. He saw this attitude everywhere. People blamed the government, or immigrants, or bad luck. They spoke as if nothing was their fault, and nothing could be changed. But they also refused help, distrusted outsiders, and resented anyone who seemed to be doing better. Many of JD's peers dropped out of school or barely showed up. Some of them had parents who collected disability checks despite being able to work. Some worked cash jobs and still complained about being left behind. JD's not without empathy, but he's honest. There was laziness, there was entitlement, there was resentment, and there was a refusal to take ownership. This is where JD's views become controversial. He doesn't deny that poverty is real. He doesn't deny that trauma is generational. But he also believes that too often his community used hardship as an excuse. Pain became an identity. Struggle became a lifestyle. And blame became a weapon. He recalls one example vividly. A man JD knew was fired from his job because he missed too many shifts. Then that same man went on Facebook, ranting about how Obama's economy had failed him. But in JD's view, the economy didn't make him late. The economy didn't make him unreliable. It was this kind of thinking that frustrated JD. He believed that part of the hillbilly crisis wasn't external. It was internal. A breakdown in values, a loss of discipline, a failure to model responsibility to the next generation. He also noticed how children were caught in this trap. Kids growing up in chaos didn't have a chance to build emotional resilience. Many were raised by grandparents. Others bounced between homes, just like JD had. Some were victims of abuse. Others simply faded away. Even in school, the system was broken. Teachers were underpaid and overwhelmed. Expectations were low. College was talked about like a fantasy, something rich people did. And so ambition died before it ever had a chance. In this environment, JD found himself torn. On one hand, he loved his people. He loved their toughness, their humor, their sense of loyalty. He admired their history, descendants of frontiersmen, coal miners, and steel workers who had helped build America. But on the other hand, he saw the damage being done by apathy, by addiction, and by the refusal to change. He also saw how these cultural patterns fed into political movements. Many in his community felt ignored by elites, laughed at by the media, and betrayed by both political parties. When JD watched the 2016 election unfold, He wasn't surprised by the rise of populism. He had seen it coming for years. In his view, the hillbilly culture was in a bind. It distrusted outsiders, but needed help. It wanted better schools, but hated government. It wanted jobs, but refused to move for them. It longed for respect, but often acted in self-destructive ways. That tension between dignity and dysfunction is at the heart of JD's analysis. He's careful not to lecture. He doesn't say that poor white Americans are lazy or unworthy. He says they're wounded. Their pain is real. But until they confront the internal damage, no amount of government spending will fix it. JD doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he offers one insight. Culture matters. And changing a culture starts with individual choices. Showing up to work, getting off drugs, staying married, raising your kids with stability. These aren't just personal achievements. They're acts of cultural rebellion. For JD, escaping the cycle wasn't just about money. It was about mindset. And the first step was believing that something better was possible. Scene 5, The Turning Point, Marine Corps and Discipline. For most of his childhood, JD Vance felt like he was just surviving, dodging chaos, absorbing pain, and trying to hold on to some piece of hope. But by the time he finished high school, he knew something had to change. He wasn't ready for college. He didn't have the money, the discipline, or the belief in himself to make it through. So, at age 18, he did something radical for a kid like him. He joined the United States Marine Corps. It was one of the best decisions of his life. JD admits he didn't fully know what he was getting into. He just knew he needed something, anything, to break the cycle. And that's exactly what the Marines gave him. At boot camp, everything changed. For the first time, he had structure. He had rules. He had expectations. No one cared about his past. No one pitied him. If he messed up, he paid the price. If he worked hard, he earned respect. And for JD, that simplicity was liberating. He learned how to make his bed, how to shine his boots, how to follow orders, but more importantly, he learned how to believe in his own competence. The Marines taught him how to manage money, how to hold people accountable, and how to set goals that weren't just dreams, they were plans. For a kid who grew up in emotional chaos, the clarity of military life was healing. JD served in Iraq, but the most important battles he fought were internal. He had to overcome his self-doubt, his fear of failure, and his tendency to give up when things got hard. And in doing so, he began to rewire the way he thought about life. He saw other Marines who came from broken homes like his. Some had suffered even worse. And yet, they were succeeding. Not because they had some magical gift, but because the Corps had given them something they'd never had before, a second chance backed by structure. JD remembers a particular moment while deployed, getting yelled at by a drill instructor for not properly stowing his gear. In that moment, he realized something. No one was going to save him. And more importantly, no one was going to stop him either. His success or failure was entirely in his hands. After 4 years, JD left the Marines a changed man. He had money in the bank thanks to financial discipline. He had confidence thanks to earned achievements. And he had clarity. He wanted to go to college. He didn't want to drift. He wanted to build. The Marines hadn't erased his past, but they had given him a future. And perhaps more importantly, they had done what no one else in his life had managed to do. They made him feel like he was in control. JD reflects on this with admiration and sadness, because not everyone has access to that kind of transformative experience. He wonders what would happen if more young men from his hometown had been given the same challenge, the same discipline, the same sense of earned pride. He doesn't glorify war. He doesn't suggest the military is for everyone, but he's clear. Without the Marine Corps, he wouldn't be who he is today. This was the hinge moment. JD had spent his youth reacting, ducking from blow-ups, hiding from shame, riding waves of fear and confusion. Now, for the first time, he was acting, with intention, with purpose, and with confidence. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a break from the hillbilly cycle, and the first real proof that his story didn't have to end the way it started. Scene 6. Escaping the Cycle. Yale Law and Imposter Syndrome. After leaving the Marines, J.D. Vance enrolled in college at Ohio State University. He was focused, disciplined, determined, and for the first time in his life, he was thriving academically. He finished his degree in just 2 years while working part-time and attending summer classes. He was no longer just surviving, he was building, and his goal was clear. He wanted to be a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. J.D. set his sights on one of the most elite institutions in the country, Yale Law School. And he got in. For a boy from Middletown, Ohio, that was like landing on another planet. Yale was a different world, filled with students who had prep school educations, who spoke in polished tones, who had grown up taking international vacations and attending cocktail parties. J.D. arrived with a cheap suit, a discount haircut, and a sense of awe he could barely hide. He was surrounded by privilege, and yet no one seemed to notice. To them, this world was normal. To J.D., it felt like a secret club he'd accidentally crashed. He struggled with imposter syndrome. He kept wondering, do I really belong here? He didn't know the rules, how to network, how to talk to professors, how to land prestigious internships. He didn't know what white-shoe law firms were. He didn't understand the importance of social connections, and he didn't know who to ask. J.D. tells the story of attending a dinner with a prominent judge. He wasn't sure what fork to use. He didn't know how to make small talk. He was terrified of being exposed as an outsider. It wasn't that he wasn't smart, he was. But Yale demanded more than intelligence. It demanded fluency in a culture of power. And J.D. had never learned that language. This is where his experience became more than just personal. It became sociological. He began to understand how class shapes not just opportunity, but behavior. People from elite backgrounds had invisible advantages. They knew how to carry themselves. They knew who to call when they were in trouble. They had mentors, coaches, networks. J.D. had mama and grit. He began to see how the American meritocracy, while real, was also rigged in subtle ways. It wasn't just about talent, it was about access. And for people like him, access was never guaranteed. Still, he pressed on. He learned how to navigate the system. He found mentors. He studied how his classmates behaved and mimicked their habits. And gradually, he began to feel more confident. Not just as a student, but as a person. But something else was happening too. The more successful J.D. became, the more he felt the pull of his past. He struggled with guilt. He worried he was abandoning the people who raised him. He questioned whether he had truly escaped, or just learned how to pretend. When he met his future wife, Usha, an Indian-American classmate at Yale, the contrast was even sharper. Usha came from a stable, educated, and supportive family. Her life was orderly. J.D.'s was chaotic. They came from different planets, and J.D. sometimes found himself sabotaging the relationship, afraid she'd see the brokenness he carried inside. It wasn't easy, but Usha didn't walk away. She challenged him to grow, to confront his trauma, to stop making excuses, to stop flinching every time things got hard. In her, J.D. found not just a partner, but a mirror. He began therapy. He started untangling the emotional knots from his past, and he realized something painful but liberating. Escaping the cycle isn't just about success, it's about healing. Yale didn't erase his hillbilly roots, but it gave him the tools to understand them. It gave him perspective, and it showed him that the habits he learned from Mama, discipline, resilience, blunt honesty, could coexist with the skills he was now acquiring. Diplomacy, professionalism, strategic thinking. He didn't have to choose between the two worlds. He could belong to both, or at least try. For J.D., Yale was never just about a law degree. It was a proving ground, a place where he tested whether a boy from a broken family, from a culture of despair, could build something lasting, something stable, something real. The answer, slowly, was yes. Scene 7. Love, family, and rebuilding. By the time J.D. Vance finished law school, he had done something remarkable. He had defied the odds. He had escaped the chaos of his childhood, earned a degree from Yale, and launched a successful career. But what came next was harder, and in some ways, more important. J.D. had to learn how to build a life worth keeping. He was now in a serious relationship with Usha, his classmate and eventual wife. She came from a completely different world, stable, loving, and high-achieving. Her parents were immigrants from India, hardworking, supportive, and deeply rooted in their values. J.D. loved her. But love, he discovered, wasn't enough. Because despite all his external success, he still carried the wounds of his past, and those wounds didn't magically heal when he put on a suit or walked into a law firm. They followed him into his marriage, into his decisions, into his reactions. He struggled with anger. He had trouble trusting. Small disagreements would trigger big emotions. He found himself slipping into old habits, shutting down, lashing out, running from vulnerability. Usha didn't accept excuses. She didn't see J.D. as a broken man in need of saving. She saw him as someone responsible for his own healing. She challenged him to face his pain instead of masking it, to stop blaming his past and start owning his future. It was the hardest lesson of all. J.D. began to understand something fundamental. Escaping poverty was not just about money. It was about emotional stability, about learning how to love without fear, about parenting without rage, about living without the expectation of disaster around every corner. He went to therapy. He read books. He talked, really talked, with Usha about his upbringing, his shame, his fears, and slowly, something shifted. He stopped reacting. He started responding. He began to build what he never had, a healthy relationship, rooted in trust, communication, and shared goals. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And then, J.D. and Usha had a child. This was a turning point J.D. had both longed for and feared. He wanted to be a good father, but how do you model what you've never seen? He found himself wrestling with deep anxieties. Would he snap like his mother? Would he run like his father? Would the past creep into the present? But then, he remembered Mama. He remembered her saying, "You can do it. You're not your mother." He held on to that. He chose to be different. He chose to be present. He chose to be gentle, even when his instincts told him to fight. For J.D., fatherhood became an act of rebellion against everything he had known. It was his chance to break the cycle, not just escape it. In quiet moments, he realized something powerful. The greatest achievement in his life wasn't Yale or his career. It was creating a home that felt safe. A home where laughter replaced shouting, where routine replaced chaos, where love wasn't conditional. This didn't mean he forgot where he came from. He still loved his family, still respected their resilience, but he no longer let that past define his future. He carried the lessons forward, the toughness, the pride, the grit, but left behind the fear, the volatility, and the emotional violence. In that transformation, Hillbilly Elegy becomes more than a memoir. It becomes a blueprint. JD doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he shows that change is possible, that healing is hard, but worth it, that love, real love, is something you have to learn, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not run from their past, but refuse to repeat it. Scene 8. Reflections. Culture, Responsibility, and America's Future. As J.D. Vance reflects on his journey from a chaotic childhood in Middletown to the Marine Corps to Yale Law to fatherhood, he turns his gaze outward, toward his community, toward the millions of Americans who grew up like he did but didn't get out. He asks a haunting question: what happens to a country when a large part of its people feel forgotten, not just by the economy, but by culture, politics, and even themselves? JD doesn't offer easy answers. What he offers instead is a challenge to see clearly, to face hard truths about poverty, family breakdown, and cultural despair. He's critical of both the left and the right. He believes the left underestimates the power of personal responsibility and assumes that every struggle is a result of structural oppression. But he also believes the right often ignores trauma and pretends that grit alone is enough. In his view, both matter: structure and culture, economics and emotions, systems and choices. JD knows firsthand how pain is passed down. He knows what it means to grow up in chaos, but he also knows how damaging it is when people stop trying, when they surrender to fatalism, when they blame everyone but themselves. He calls this learned helplessness with pride attached. It's the belief that you've been screwed by the world, so you're entitled to give up. And that mindset, JD says, is a recipe for ruin. He's particularly concerned about fatherlessness. In many of the communities he grew up around, children were raised by grandparents or single mothers. The men were absent, addicted, or unstable. And that absence had consequences, not just financially, but emotionally. JD doesn't just mourn the loss of jobs, he mourns the loss of accountability, of decency, of what Mama called hillbilly justice, a sense that you take care of your family, show up to work, and don't make excuses. He also worries about what he calls the soft bigotry of low expectations. Too many teachers, politicians, and media elites assume that poor white kids aren't capable of more. They're pitied, but not pushed. Told they're victims, but not challenged to rise. In JD's world, that's dangerous, because while pity might feel kind, it's disempowering. What kids like him needed wasn't a pass. They needed belief, and boundaries, and someone to say, "You're capable, but no one's coming to do it for you." This isn't just a rural or Rust Belt issue. JD sees these same dynamics in working-class communities across the country, urban and rural, white and non-white. When family structures break down, when institutions erode, and when people stop believing in themselves, despair takes root. And despair, he warns, is contagious. JD doesn't deny that policies matter, but he believes culture matters too. The way people talk to each other, the way families treat their children, the values that are modeled or not modeled in everyday life. He also believes that upward mobility is still possible, but it's shrinking. And when people don't believe in the ladder anymore, they stop climbing. So what's the answer? For JD, it's not about massive government programs or political slogans. It's about rebuilding the basics: families that stay together, schools that demand excellence, communities that care, and a culture that says success is not shameful and responsibility is not optional. He believes we must tell a new story, one where toughness doesn't mean violence, where pride doesn't mean self-sabotage, where love doesn't mean enabling, and where progress doesn't mean abandoning your roots, but strengthening them. In the end, Hillbilly Elegy isn't just JD's story, it's America's story. A story of promise, pain, and the ongoing fight to rise. It's a warning against complacency, a plea for empathy, and above all, a call to remember that where we come from shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. Scene 9. One story, many lessons. In the final pages of Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance leaves us not with answers, but with insight. His story, so specific, so personal, is not meant to stand in for everyone else's. He knows that not every person from Appalachia, or the Rust Belt, or working-class America shares his exact path. But the patterns, the pain, the resilience, they echo. His memoir is not an elegy for a person, but for a culture that once prided itself on hard work, tight-knit families, and faith, but now struggles with addiction, anger, and abandonment. It's also a culture that feels invisible, forgotten by policymakers, ridiculed by elites, and misunderstood by media. And yet, it is still a part of America's soul. J.D. doesn't pretend to be its spokesman. He's a product of it, and also, in some ways, its critic. He doesn't condemn his family. He loves them. He doesn't excuse their failures, but he explains them. He shows how trauma, when repeated long enough, becomes the air children breathe, and how hope, once lost, is not easily recovered. But the most powerful message of his book is this: you can break the cycle. Not easily, not perfectly, not without scars, but you can. J.D. did it with the help of a foul-mouthed grandmother, a military institution that demanded excellence, a wife who challenged him to grow, and a decision, repeated every day, not to surrender to the pain of his past. He made it, but he knows he's the exception. And his greatest fear is that more kids like him won't. That's why he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, not to boast, not to judge, but to shine a light on a part of America that most people never see, unless they're born into it. He wants people to understand that poverty isn't just about money, it's about chaos, that success isn't just about opportunity, it's about stability, and that change isn't just about politics, it's about culture, values, and the daily decisions we make. As the book closes, J.D. is no longer just the hillbilly kid from Middletown. He's a father, a husband, a Yale graduate, a man still working through his past, but no longer controlled by it. And that's the final lesson. You don't have to be perfect to heal. You don't have to forget where you came from to move forward, and you don't have to wait for someone else to fix things. Sometimes the change begins with you. This is J.D. Vance's elegy, and through it, he invites us all to ask, what are we doing with our families, our communities, and our country to make sure the next child like him doesn't just survive, but thrives? Scene 10. J.D. Vance. After Hillbilly Elegy, legacy, controversy, and politics. When Hillbilly Elegy was released in 2016, it struck a nerve across the political spectrum. J.D. Vance had written a deeply personal memoir, but by accident or fate, it landed in the middle of a national identity crisis. The United States was reeling. The working class was angry. Donald Trump had just stunned the world by winning the presidency. And suddenly, Hillbilly Elegy wasn't just a book. It was a cultural decoder. Pundits, journalists, and politicians turned to it to explain the Trump voter, white working-class rage, and the forgotten middle of the country. Vance became a media fixture, often positioned, willingly or not, as the voice of Appalachian America. The book became a #1 bestseller. It was praised as honest, urgent, and revealing. Readers applauded its empathy, its clarity, its rare insight into a part of America that had long been ignored. But there was backlash too. Some critics argued that Vance downplayed systemic inequality, that he focused too much on personal responsibility and not enough on policy failures. Others accused him of generalizing the Appalachian experience or ignoring the role of race in American poverty. Still others were wary of how the political right used his memoir as a kind of moral shield, proof that government programs didn't work, or that poor communities only needed bootstraps to survive. The conversation was loud, and Vance, previously a quiet, thoughtful law graduate, was suddenly at the center of a national storm. Then came the Netflix adaptation, directed by Ron Howard and starring Glenn Close as Memoir. The Hillbilly Elegy film premiered in 2020. Like the book, it polarized audiences. Some viewers were moved. Others panned it as shallow, oversimplified, or tone-deaf. But the debate only amplified what Hillbilly Elegy had already become: a symbol of struggle, of division, of the American identity crisis. And as the years passed, so did J.D. Vance's public transformation. In the book, he had described himself as a political conservative, but one disillusioned with extremism. He was critical of Trump's rhetoric and wary of populist anger. He called for nuance, decency, and rebuilding community values from the ground up. But by 2021, something had changed. J.D. Vance announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate in Ohio. And this time, he wasn't distancing himself from Trump. He was embracing him. He pivoted hard to the populist right. On the campaign trail, he railed against globalist elites, tech monopolies, and liberal institutions. He criticized immigration policy, cultural liberalism, and what he called woke capitalism. He aligned himself with the MAGA movement, and in 2022, he won the Senate seat, backed by Donald Trump himself. For some of his early readers, this was shocking. How had the thoughtful, introspective memoirist become a fiery political warrior? But for others, it made perfect sense. Vance had always warned of cultural despair. He had always talked about the disconnect between elite America and the working class. Now, he was channeling that resentment into political power. And in doing so, he became something rare, a best-selling author who turned into a national politician. His critics saw it as betrayal, opportunism, a rejection of the moral humility that had made Hillbilly Elegy so powerful. His supporters saw it as evolution, as courage, as someone finally taking action, not just writing books. So which is it? Has J.D. Vance changed? Or is he just revealing a side of himself that was always there? The answer, like much of his story, is complicated. He still speaks about family, faith, and responsibility. He still invokes Mama's values, but now he does so from the Senate floor, shaping laws, influencing debates, and helping steer the direction of a divided country. And through it all, Hillbilly Elegy remains both a lens and a mirror. It's a story of one man's escape, a portrait of a region's pain, a meditation on identity, resilience, and class. And now, it's also the origin story of a U.S. senator who believes America is in the midst of cultural civil war. For listeners, readers, and voters alike, J.D. Vance represents a new kind of figure, one forged in the fires of personal trauma, polished by elite education, and radicalized by the politics of the present. Is he a bridge between worlds, or a sign of their deepening divide? Time will tell. But one thing is certain, J.D. Vance's story is no longer just a memoir. It's part of the American story. And it's still being written. Thank you for listening to this audiobook summary from Pastcast. If you found it valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel for more thoughtful reviews and historical insights. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.